It started with a kiss, a single act that was supposed to save her life. But that kiss would ignite a media firestorm, destroy reputations, and uncover a secret that shocked the entire world. This isn't a love story. It's a mystery about power, truth, and the price of doing what's right. One moment, captured by a dozen cameras, would unravel lives, expose hidden agendas, and force us all to confront an uncomfortable question. When does protection become manipulation? When does heroism become scandal? And most importantly, who decides? What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about the headlines you've read, the stories you've been told, and the narratives that shape our understanding of right and wrong. Because sometimes the truth isn't just stranger than fiction, it's far more dangerous. But who was really saving who? That's the question that haunted investigators, journalists, and millions of people around the world as they watched this story unfold in real time. Because what started as a single moment of apparent bravery would become a labyrinth of deception, hidden motives, and revelations that no one saw coming. The answer to that question wouldn't just determine the fate of two people, it would expose an entire system built on silence, power, and the careful construction of public perception. And by the time the truth finally emerged, nothing would ever be the same. Was it an act of compassion or manipulation? Why did a man with everything risk it all for a stranger? And how did one moment of bravery turn into a global scandal that ended careers and lives? These weren't just philosophical questions debated in coffee shops and comment sections. They were questions that lawyers, federal investigators, and eventually a grand jury would have to answer. Because what happened on that yacht wasn't just a viral moment. It was a crime scene. And everyone involved, from the billionaire himself to the woman he kissed, from the witnesses who stood frozen in shock to the man who sparked it all, they all had something to hide. The truth was buried under layers of carefully crafted statements, strategic silence, and a media machine that turned reality into entertainment before anyone could understand what they were actually watching. By the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about love and justice. You'll wonder how many other stories you've consumed without questioning. You'll realize that the loudest voices in any scandal are rarely the ones telling the truth. And you'll understand why sometimes the most heroic acts are the ones that destroy the hero. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to before the cameras, before the headlines, before the world decided who these people were. We need to go back to when they were just two strangers living separate lives, unaware that fate was about to collide them together in the most spectacular and destructive way possible. Before the headlines, she was just Jasmine Cole, a 42-year-old art curator from Charleston, South Carolina. Brilliant, quiet, divorced. To her friends, she was rebuilding her life. To herself, she was just surviving. Jasmine had spent the last 3 years piecing together an existence after her marriage fell apart. After her ex-husband's legal troubles became her public humiliation, after the art world that had once celebrated her vision suddenly couldn't return her calls. She'd moved from a historic downtown loft to a modest apartment in the suburbs, traded gallery openings for online appraisals, and learned to find peace in anonymity. Her calendar was predictable. Morning coffee on the balcony, client consultations via video chat, evening walks through the park where no one knew her name or her story. It was a small life, but it was hers, built carefully on the ruins of everything she'd lost. Her colleagues from the old days rarely reached out anymore. The divorce hadn't just ended a marriage, it had severed connections, dissolved friendships that turned out to be more professional courtesy than genuine bond. The few people who still called did so with that careful tone people use when they're not sure if you're okay but don't really want to know the details. Jasmine had learned to recognize that tone, learned to give the answers that would end the conversation quickly and politely. She was fine. She was moving forward. She was exploring new opportunities. All technically true, all carefully designed to prevent follow-up questions. Because the truth was more complicated, more exhausting, more difficult to explain to people who'd never had their entire life reduced to gossip and speculation. But Jasmine was more than her circumstances. She had a gift for seeing beauty in forgotten things, for understanding the stories that objects carried across time. That talent hadn't disappeared with her marriage or her reputation. It was still there, sharp and instinctive, in the way she could look at a painting and know immediately if it was genuine or forged, in the way she could trace the provenance of an artifact through subtle details that others missed. That gift was what kept her working, kept clients seeking her expertise even if they no longer invited her to their galas. It was her lifeline to the world she'd lost, proof that she was still valuable even if she was no longer visible. And it was that gift that would eventually lead her to an invitation she almost threw away. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, cream-colored and heavy, with her name written in elegant calligraphy that suggested either great wealth or great pretension. Jasmine almost tossed it into the recycling bin with the grocery store flyers and credit card offers. She learned to be suspicious of anything that looked too expensive, too formal, too good to be true. In her experience, people who wanted something from her were usually direct about it. They sent emails with dollar amounts and deadlines. They didn't send handwritten invitations that looked like they'd been transported from another century. But something made her pause, made her slide her finger under the sealed flap and pull out the card inside. What she read made her heart beat faster for the first time in months. It was an invitation to authenticate a private collection aboard a yacht during a charity gala. The collector's name wasn't mentioned, but the pieces described were extraordinary. Renaissance bronzes, Georgian silver, a rumored Caravaggio that had been missing for decades. The kind of opportunity that could resurrect a career, or at least remind the world that Jasmine Cole still existed, still mattered, still had something to offer beyond being a footnote in someone else's scandal. The fee mentioned was generous but not obscene, professional but not desperate. Everything about it felt legitimate, carefully constructed to appeal to exactly who she was and what she needed. And perhaps that should have been her first warning, because legitimate opportunities rarely arrive in the mail addressed to people the world has already decided to forget. Jasmine held that invitation for 3 days before responding. She'd take it out of the drawer where she'd hidden it, read it again, imagine herself in that world again, then put it back and tell herself all the reasons it was a bad idea. She'd been burned before by people who seemed to want her expertise, but really wanted her name attached to something questionable. She'd learned that in her world, there was no such thing as a simple transaction. Everything came with strings, with expectations, with the potential for disaster. But the alternative was another year of video consultations and walks in the park where no one knew her name. Another year of being invisible, of watching her talent atrophy from disuse, of wondering if she'd ever be more than the woman who'd married the wrong man and paid the price. On the 3rd day, she sent her acceptance, professional, brief, with questions about logistics and a request for more details about the collection. The response came within hours, answering every question, providing every detail, making everything seem perfectly reasonable and above board. There would be other experts present, other guests, security protocols, and a contract that protected everyone involved. It all looked legitimate. It all felt like exactly what she needed. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe she wanted it too badly to see what should have been obvious, Maybe she was so hungry for redemption that she couldn't taste the poison in the invitation. Or maybe, just maybe, she knew exactly what she was walking into and decided the risk was worth it anyway. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Across the ocean, Damon Holt, the billionaire industrialist with a reputation for danger, ruthless in business, but known for one thing off camera: protecting the people nobody else would. But what no one knew was that Damon had a debt, one that could only be repaid in blood. Or at least, that's what the tabloids would eventually claim. The truth about Damon Holt was far more complex than any headline could capture, far more nuanced than any profile could convey. He'd built an empire on precision, on understanding systems and exploiting their weaknesses before anyone else saw the opportunity. Tech infrastructure, rare earth minerals, shipping logistics, the invisible machinery that made modern life possible. He wasn't the kind of billionaire who courted attention or gave inspirational speeches. He was the kind who owned the companies that owned the companies, whose name appeared in footnotes and subsidiary filings, whose influence was felt but never seen. But there was another side to Damon Holt, one that existed in the margins of police reports and sealed court records. 3 times in the past decade, people in his orbit had disappeared from dangerous situations. A journalist who'd been investigating human trafficking networks suddenly relocated with a new identity and a trust fund. A whistleblower who'd exposed corporate malfeasance received anonymous protection that no law enforcement agency would claim credit for. A young woman who'd testified against a cartel operative vanished the night before retaliation was expected, only to resurface 2 years later in a country with no extradition treaty and a new life already built and waiting. The pattern was there for anyone who cared to look, but few did. And those who did found their investigations hitting walls, their sources going silent, their editors suddenly concerned about liability. Damon never acknowledged these interventions. When asked directly, which was rare, he'd deflect with the skill of someone who'd spent decades avoiding accountability while technically breaking no laws. He'd funded scholarships for at-risk youth, donated to organizations that helped people escape domestic violence, supported legal aid clinics that took on cases nobody else would touch. All public record, all perfectly legal, all carefully designed to create plausible deniability for the things that happened in the shadows. Because the truth was that Damon Holt had learned early that the legal system couldn't always protect the people who needed it most. Sometimes justice required resources that the law wouldn't provide. Sometimes survival meant breaking the rules that allowed predators to thrive. That philosophy had cost him 2 divorces, both settlements sealed, but rumored to be astronomical. A sister who hadn't spoken to him in 15 years after he'd intervened in her abusive marriage in ways that terrified her as much as they'd terrified her husband. A son who lived across the country and refused to acknowledge their relationship in public. Friends who distanced themselves when they realized his protection came with strings, with expectations, with the implicit understanding that he decided what was best for everyone in his sphere. Damon had built walls around himself not just for privacy, but for survival, because the alternative was explaining to people why he did what he did, why he couldn't stop even when it destroyed everything else in his life. The yacht was his sanctuary, his fortress, the one place where he controlled every variable. State-of-the-art security, crew members who'd been with him for decades, technology that could detect threats before they materialized. He hosted events there occasionally, charity galas that satisfied social obligations while raising money for causes he actually believed in. But those events were the theater, carefully choreographed performances where he played the role of gracious host, while his real attention was always elsewhere, always scanning for problems, always prepared for the moment when performance became crisis. Because Damon Holt had learned through painful experience that danger didn't announce itself. It arrived disguised as normalcy, as celebration, as the exact moment when everyone else was too distracted to notice. The charity gala, scheduled for that October evening, was supposed to be routine. 100 guests, mostly people who'd paid obscene amounts for the privilege of drinking champagne on a billionaire's yacht while feeling good about their contribution to ocean conservation. Damon had hired additional security, as he always did, and, personally, reviewed the guest list 3 times, as he always did, looking for patterns and connections that might indicate trouble. He'd flagged 2 names, had them investigated, decided the risk was minimal. He'd arranged for multiple exit strategies, emergency protocols, communication systems that would work even if everything else failed. He'd done everything right, everything he always did, and it still wouldn't be enough. Because there was one variable he hadn't accounted for. One guest whose invitation had been carefully orchestrated by someone else. Someone who understood exactly how to exploit the systems Damon had built to protect himself. Jasmine Cole's name meant nothing to him when he reviewed the list. Art curator, divorced, unremarkable. Hired to authenticate part of his collection, a legitimate reason to be there, no red flags in her background check beyond the ex-husband's legal troubles, and those were years old and seemed unrelated to anything that should concern him. He'd approved her invitation without a second thought, and that decision, that single moment of routine approval, would set in motion events that would destroy everything he'd built and everything he'd been trying to protect. What Damon didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jasmine Cole's ex-husband hadn't just been involved in legal troubles. He'd been a courier, a middleman, someone who moved information and money for people who couldn't afford to be connected to either. And 3 years ago, he'd made the mistake of trying to leverage that information for his own benefit. The divorce hadn't been Jasmine's choice. It had been orchestrated, forced, designed to separate her from the fallout when her husband disappeared into federal witness protection after testifying against people who had very long memories and very deep resources. Jasmine had been collateral damage, her reputation destroyed as part of the cover story, her life dismantled to make the narrative believable. She'd been told she was safe, that the sacrifice would protect her, that nobody would have any reason to connect her to what her husband had done. But someone had been patient. Someone had been watching, waiting for the right opportunity, the right moment when all the pieces could be moved into place. And when they'd learned about Damon Holt's charity gala, when they'd discovered he was looking for an expert to authenticate part of his collection, they'd seen their chance. The invitation hadn't come from Damon. It had come from someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the situation, how to get Jasmine onto that yacht at the exact moment when her presence would create the chaos they needed. And when Jasmine stepped onto that yacht, his past came back to collect. It happened at 9:42 p.m., during a charity gala on Holt's private yacht. Witnesses say a man approached Jasmine, shouting accusations, reaching for her arm. Cameras were rolling. In a split-second decision, Damon pulled her close and kissed her. But to understand what happened in that moment, you need to understand what the cameras didn't show, what the witnesses didn't see, what the headlines would never capture. Because the official story, the one that would dominate news cycles for weeks, was so far from the truth that it might as well have been fiction, and by the time anyone understood what had really happened, the damage would already be done. Jasmine had been standing near the stern, examining a bronze sculpture that she'd just determined was a 19th century reproduction rather than the Renaissance original it had been claimed to be. She was making notes, preparing the diplomatic language she'd used to deliver disappointing news to whoever had paid significantly more than the piece was worth, when she heard her name. Not Jasmine. Her married name. The one she hadn't used in 3 years, the one that should have been buried with her old life. She turned, and her heart stopped. Because the man walking toward her with purpose and fury in his eyes was someone she'd seen before years ago. In a photograph, her ex-husband had shown her during one of those late-night conversations when the walls came down and he'd admitted more than he should have. The man was talking, loud enough that people nearby were turning to look, but Jasmine couldn't process the words. Her mind was racing through calculations, through possibilities, through the sudden understanding that she'd been set up, that the invitation hadn't been opportunity but trap. She saw him reach into his jacket, saw the movement that could have been innocent but probably wasn't, saw her future collapsing into a single moment of violence that would happen in front of 100 people and accomplish exactly what someone wanted. She opened her mouth to scream, to warn someone, to do anything that might change what was about to happen. And then, Damon was there. Not running, not shouting. Just suddenly present in the space between Jasmine and the man who was reaching for her. She'd barely noticed him all evening, had glimpsed him across the deck playing host, but hadn't paid attention because her focus had been on the collection, on doing her job, on avoiding the social dynamics that made events like this exhausting. But now, he was right there, close enough that she could see the scar on his left temple, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with sea air, close enough that when he moved, it felt like the world was tilting. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between apology and determination, and then his hand was on the back of her neck, and he was pulling her toward him. The kiss lasted 4 seconds. Jasmine counted them later when she watched the footage that would be played on every news channel and dissected on every social media platform. 4 seconds that felt like an eternity, that felt like drowning, that felt like being seen and erased simultaneously. His lips were warm and firm and tasted like champagne. His hand was gentle on her neck, but his body was tense, coiled, ready for something she didn't understand. The cameras flashed, people gasped, someone laughed nervously. And, in that moment of distraction, 2 security guards appeared and quietly escorted the man away. No drama, no confrontation, just smooth, professional removal that happened so quickly most people didn't even notice. When Damon released her, Jasmine stumbled backward. Her lips were numb. Her mind was blank. The yacht was still moving. The music was still playing. The party was continuing as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. She looked at Damon, searching for explanation, but he was already turning away, already moving toward another group of guests, already performing the role of host, as if he hadn't just kissed a stranger in front of 100 witnesses. One of the security guards was next to her now, speaking in low tones, guiding her away from the crowd, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding, that she wasn't in any trouble, that someone would take her home shortly. She let herself be guided because she didn't know what else to do. To some, it was a rescue. To others, a stunt. But to Jasmine, it was the moment her life stopped being her own. Because within hours, that kiss went viral. Someone had been recording on their phone, multiple someones actually, and by the time Jasmine reached her apartment, the footage was everywhere. Twitter was exploding with speculation. Reddit threads were analyzing every frame. News outlets were frantically trying to identify her, to understand the context, to turn a 4-second moment into a narrative that would sustain coverage for days. Her phone was already ringing with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Her email was filling with interview requests. And somewhere, in an office she'd never see, someone was watching all of this happen and smiling because everything was going exactly according to plan. The next morning, the story had a name: The Billionaire's Kiss. Talk shows dissected every frame. Online detectives demanded answers, and Jasmine disappeared. Not because she wanted to, not because she was trying to avoid responsibility, but because when she woke up and saw what the world had decided about her, she knew she had no choice. The headlines were brutal: opportunist, gold digger, the woman who seduced a billionaire. Every article included her worst photos, the ones from her divorce proceedings where she'd looked exhausted and defeated. Every piece of her past was being excavated and weaponized. Her ex-husband's crimes were being relitigated as if she'd been complicit. Friends from decades ago were being interviewed about her character. The art world was buzzing with speculation about whether she'd fabricated her credentials, whether her expertise was legitimate, whether she'd been planning this all along. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter anymore. The narrative had been established in those first viral hours, and everything that came after was just confirmation bias. People finding evidence to support the story they'd already decided to believe. Jasmine sat in her apartment watching her life be destroyed in real time. Watching strangers debate her morals and her motives, watching her reputation burn faster than she could possibly respond. She called the event organizers, trying to explain, but they'd already released a statement distancing themselves from the incident. She called Damon Holt's office, desperate for some kind of clarification, but was told he wasn't available and wouldn't be making any statements. She was completely alone, trapped in her apartment while the world outside decided who she was and what she'd done. The paparazzi arrived on the second day. Not just 1 or 2 photographers, but a full contingent, camping outside her building, following her car when she tried to leave, shouting questions designed to provoke reactions that would make good footage. Jasmine stopped answering her door. She closed her curtains. She survived on whatever food was already in her pantry because going to the grocery store meant running a gauntlet of cameras and accusations. Her landlord called, uncomfortable, explaining that other tenants were complaining about the disruption. Her remaining clients sent polite emails canceling upcoming projects. Her bank called about unusual activity, suspicious charges, someone trying to access her accounts using information that should have been private. On the third day, Jasmine made a decision. She couldn't fight this battle from her apartment. She couldn't defend herself through statements and press releases that no one would believe. She needed time, space, and resources that she didn't have. So she did the one thing that would make everything worse before it could possibly get better. She left. Not permanently. Not with a plan, just a hastily packed bag and a borrowed car and a desperate need to be somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't here. She left her phone on the kitchen counter, turned off and useless. She left a note for her landlord about rent being paid automatically. And she disappeared into the night while the paparazzi were changing shifts, while the world was sleeping, while she still had a chance to become invisible again. But Jasmine wasn't running blind. She drove for 6 hours, through small towns and empty highways, until she reached a motel that still took cash and didn't ask for ID. She paid for a week in advance, locked herself in a room that smelled like cigarettes and bleach, and finally allowed herself to break down. She cried for the life she'd rebuilt and lost again. She cried for the injustice of being blamed for something she didn't understand. She cried because she was exhausted and terrified and completely out of options. And when she was done crying, when there were no tears left, She made another decision. She would tell her story, not to the media, not to the public that had already decided to hate her, but to someone who might actually care about the truth. Then, 3 days later, a letter arrived at a New York newsroom, signed only J.C. The letter was handwritten, 8 pages long, and it told a story that no one had been expecting. It claimed Jasmine hadn't disappeared because she was guilty, but because she'd been targeted. It described the man who'd approached her on the yacht, not by name, but by enough details that someone could identify him if they wanted to. It explained her ex-husband's history in vague terms, enough to establish context without revealing information that might put him in danger. It claimed that powerful people were trying to silence her, that the media circus wasn't accidental, but orchestrated, that she needed protection that the police couldn't or wouldn't provide. The journalist who received the letter was skeptical. Anonymous tips were common, and most led nowhere. But something about this one felt different. The handwriting was steady and deliberate. The details were specific enough to verify. And most importantly, the letter didn't ask for anything. It didn't demand coverage or threaten lawsuits. It just presented information and let the recipient decide what to do with it. The journalist spent 2 days checking facts, making calls, trying to verify claims that seemed outlandish but kept checking out. The man Jasmine described had a criminal record. Her ex-husband had testified in a high-profile trial. The yacht's security team had filed an incident report that night, though the details were sealed. But when investigators tried to verify her claims, her trail vanished. The motel where she'd been staying was suddenly unable to provide any records. The car she'd borrowed had been returned to its owner with no explanation of where it had been. Her bank accounts showed activity that suggested she was still around, but the transactions were generic, impossible to trace to a specific location. It was as if Jasmine Cole had become a ghost, present enough to leave evidence of existence, but impossible to find or contact. The journalist published the letter with appropriate disclaimers, and immediately the story shifted. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about a gold digger, but about a woman in danger. Suddenly, people started asking different questions. Suddenly, Damon Holt's silence seemed less like arrogance and more like strategy. The backlash was immediate and brutal. People who'd spent days attacking Jasmine suddenly pivoted to defending her. Conspiracy theories exploded across social media. Death threats started arriving at the newsroom that published the letter. And somewhere, someone realized they'd lost control of the narrative they'd worked so hard to create, until someone leaked the yacht's security footage. Not the public footage that had gone viral, but the internal security cameras that showed angles no guest would have seen. The footage that showed what really happened in those seconds before the kiss. The footage revealed something no one expected. Seconds before the kiss, a man in the crowd reached into his jacket. Damon wasn't protecting his image. He was protecting her life. The leaked footage was grainy but clear enough. It showed the man approaching Jasmine with intention, showed his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket in a motion that anyone with security training would recognize. It showed Damon tracking the movement from across the deck, showed him calculating angles and timing, showed him moving with the precision of someone who'd done this before. And it showed the exact moment when he made his choice. The kiss wasn't passion. It was cover. That single act distracted everyone long enough to stop a tragedy. In the 4 seconds that Damon's lips were on Jasmine's, his security team was able to move into position, able to intercept the threat, able to remove the danger before anyone else understood what was happening. The kiss was theater, performance, a deliberate manipulation of attention that saved a life at the cost of 2 reputations. Because by the time the world saw that footage, the damage had already been done. Damon was already being investigated for assault. Jasmine was already in hiding, and the man who'd actually been the threat was already dead. But by then, the world had already decided who he was. The footage should have vindicated Damon. It should have transformed him from predator to hero overnight. Instead, it raised more questions than it answered. Why hadn't he just alerted security? Why risk the spectacle? Why kiss her instead of simply pulling her away? And most damning, how did he know what was happening unless he was expecting it? The conspiracy theories multiplied. Maybe Damon had staged the whole thing. Maybe he'd hired the man himself to create a dramatic rescue. Maybe Jasmine was in on it, part of some elaborate scheme to generate publicity or sympathy or leverage for some future negotiation. The truth was right there on the screen, but people couldn't see it because they'd already invested too much in their own versions of events. Damon's lawyers released a statement that said nothing. His business partners started distancing themselves from companies he controlled. His charitable foundation saw donations drop by 60% in a week. And through it all, he remained silent, refusing interviews, refusing to defend himself, refusing to play the game that everyone expected. Because Damon Holt understood something that most people didn't. The truth doesn't matter if people don't want to hear it. You can show them footage, present them with facts, give them every piece of evidence they need to understand what really happened, and they'll still find a way to believe the story that makes them feel smart, or righteous, or vindicated. But there was another reason for his silence. The man who'd approached Jasmine on the yacht, the one who'd reached into his jacket, the one who'd been quietly removed by security, he'd been found dead 2 days later in a hotel room 40 miles away. Overdose, according to the initial report. Suspicious timing, according to everyone else. And while the police were calling it accidental, while the toxicology reports were still pending, while the investigation was theoretically ongoing, everyone knew what it meant. Someone had cleaned up a loose end. Someone had removed a witness who might have explained what was really happening. Someone had made sure that the only people left to tell the story were the ones who had every reason to lie. Damon knew he was being framed. Not directly, not obviously, but carefully, methodically, by someone who understood how to destroy a reputation without leaving evidence. Every action he'd taken that night had been necessary, but each one looked guilty in retrospect. The kiss, the immediate removal of the threat, the silence afterward. Even the security footage, which should have exonerated him, now looked like it might have been edited, manipulated, staged. He could see the trap closing around him, could feel the walls getting smaller, and he knew that anything he said would only make it worse. Because the real story, the truth about why he'd been protecting Jasmine, about what her ex-husband had done, about the networks of criminals and informants and federal agencies that had set this whole situation in motion, that story was too complex, too classified, too dangerous to tell. So instead, Damon did what he'd always done. He went to work. He showed up at board meetings and conference calls. He made decisions about mergers and acquisitions. He pretended that his world wasn't falling apart while quietly using every resource he had to find Jasmine before someone else did. Because he understood something that the police and the media and the public didn't. The kiss hadn't just saved her life that night. It had marked her as valuable, as protected, as someone worth investigating. And now, everyone who'd been looking for her before had a new reason to look harder. The only way to end this was to find her first, bring her somewhere safe, and somehow convince her to trust the man who'd destroyed her life trying to save it. Meanwhile, Jasmine was learning what it meant to be truly invisible. She'd moved 6 times in 3 weeks, never staying anywhere longer than a few days, paying cash for everything, avoiding cameras and crowds and anywhere that might have facial recognition. She'd cut and dyed her hair. She'd bought clothes from thrift stores in sizes that didn't fit quite right, making her silhouette unrecognizable. She'd learned to walk differently, to hold her shoulders differently, to make eye contact differently. She'd become someone else not because she wanted to, but because survival required it. And every night in whatever anonymous room she was hiding in, she watched the news and saw her face and her name and her story being torn apart by people who had never met her and never would. The letter to the newsroom had been a mistake, she realized now. She'd thought telling her story would help, thought that giving people the truth would somehow shift the narrative in her favor. Instead, it had just given them more ammunition, more material to analyze and dissect and use against her. Now, she wasn't just a gold digger, she was a manipulator. She wasn't just opportunistic, she was calculating. Every word she'd written with honesty and desperation had been twisted into evidence of deception. And the more she tried to defend herself, the guiltier she looked. So she'd stopped trying. She'd gone completely dark. No letters, no calls, no attempts to communicate with anyone from her old life. She'd become exactly what they said she was, a woman with something to hide. But invisibility came with its own price. Loneliness, paranoia, the constant fear that every stranger might recognize her, might report her location, might be working for whoever had orchestrated this nightmare. Jasmine started sleeping with lights on because the dark made it too easy to imagine threats. She started eating food that didn't require cooking because going to the store felt too risky. She started talking to herself because the silence was making her forget what her own voice sounded like. This wasn't living. It was barely surviving. And she knew she couldn't do it forever. Eventually, she'd run out of money or luck or sanity. Eventually, she'd make a mistake that would bring everything crashing down. Eventually, she'd have to face the world she'd been running from. That moment came on a Tuesday morning in a diner outside of Pittsburgh. Jasmine was drinking bad coffee and eating scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard when a man sat down across from her. She didn't look up immediately, just tensed, calculating whether she could make it to the bathroom window before he could stop her. But then he spoke. And his voice was familiar in a way that made her stomach drop. "Miss Cole," he said quietly, "my name is Marcus Chen. I work for Damon Holt. And before you run, you need to know that the people looking for you are a lot closer than you think." Jasmine looked up then, really looked at him, and saw that he wasn't threatening her. He was warning her. And suddenly, all her questions about that night, about the kiss, about why a billionaire would risk everything for a stranger. Suddenly, all of those questions had answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear.